Let's look at the poem Tissue now by Imtiaz Darker. I find this poem really abstract, and it's not as directly clear a story as some of the other poems are. And even, in fact, the conflict is difficult for me to immediately identify. But having spent some time with the poem, I have some ideas on what might be going on. The title, I think, is referring to two things: paper and skin. And I think paper in the beginning and skin in the end are what this poem is really dealing with, and the relationship between these things. It's paper with its thin, fragile, temporary aspect that is attended to. It lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Somehow, the fact that light can come through can change the world, or just that change anything. Paper that's made thin by touching. So there's this relationship between paper and touching. And paper that's been touched so much takes on a kind of history that matters to the speaker. You can find this kind of paper, she says, in well-used books. For example, the back of the Quran, a religious text for Muslims, but the Quran she's speaking of is a very particular Quran that someone has, where in the back they actually write down the names and histories, who was born to whom, height and weight, deaths, and on which sepia date. Sepia is a kind of yellowing that comes to paper with age. Pages smoothed, stroked, and turned transparent with attention. So what we get here is the idea that a book, and paper particularly, is cared for, examined, but also stroked, treated almost as if it were alive, loved, attended to. Then the speaker moves to talking about a speculation. Well, I wonder, she says, if paper is cared for so much because it keeps this record of things, I wonder what buildings would be like if they were made of paper. She immediately notices that she'd feel how much they move, how just on one emotion they could shift in the direction of the wind. So they'd be more, emotion and weather would both affect them. She goes to another idea about paper. She thinks about the relationship between maps and the world. Maps are on paper, and the sun shines through them, and it shines through things like border lines, the marks of rivers, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Maps also are delicate, conditional. They move, maybe not with emotion and weather, but they can move with war. And maybe it's this stanza that starts getting us to think about maybe a hidden discussion or conversation that's going on. Fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit cards might fly our lives like paper kites. This is such a strange image. So she's talking about receipts. And the part I understand for sure is the idea that receipts are records of our lives, what we bought, what we spent with our credit cards. But she's suggesting that that almost these details themselves run our lives, fly our lives, take us somewhere, take our lives somewhere, as if the wind could make them, as if they could be carried by the wind. This is a strange and very abstract image to me. I get the idea that the paper, the receipts, have all the facts about us on them, but this particular detail, flying us like paper kites, I'm not exactly clear what's being said here. She shifts again to talking about architects. Architects could use all of this information, all of our receipts, maps, religious texts, where we write down who was born when. Take all of this and put it layer upon layer, luminous script over lines, over numbers over line, and never wish to build with brick. So if you built with paper instead of brick, you'd get the record, the complete record of the world. And this would then allow the daylight again to come through. And it would come through capital cities and monoliths, through all the shapes that pride can make. So all the buildings that we make somehow are an expression of our ego, of how proud we are. And what might happen if all of this was made of paper instead of brick and stone is that the light could come through and we could actually see and trace, follow, or copy a grand design. And now all of a sudden there's a shift again with living tissue. So if buildings were made of paper and architects built with paper, then we could start to see, it's alive. There's a living tissue, the livingness of paper. And we might build something never meant to last. Instead of buildings being permanent, they'd be temporary. And she says, of paper, again, smoothed, stroked, and thinned to be transparent. Paper that's cared for, a world that's cared for, touched, caressed, and then we get the sudden last line of turned into your skin. So if the world was paper and was cared for and we could see everything through it, all the records, all the buildings would shine the light through and we would care more about them. And these buildings wouldn't be permanent. They would be these temporary things. And this, all of a sudden, she changes into the metaphor of people. Human beings are these transparent, are this living tissue. The records of everyone and everything around them, the records of the world, the maps, the rivers, the buildings, everything. And the light that's coming through them is something to think about in this poem. What is that? So this is an extremely abstract poem that uses an extended metaphor relating paper to skin and exploring what that means to the speaker.